There's a moment in many relationships when love quietly starts working against itself. Nothing dramatic happens. No betrayal, no fight, just a slow emotional overload. This is the paradox no one prepares you for. The more you give, the less they lean in, and the more confusing it feels. Because overloving doesn't look like a problem. It looks like care, it looks like effort, it looks like commitment. It looks like doing everything right. But beneath the surface, something else is happening. Something psychological. Something most people don't recognize until it's too late. Emotional flooding. Overloving doesn't push people away because love is bad. It pushes people away because too much emotional input removes space. And without space, desire suffocates. There was a relationship that started intensely, not unhealthy, just fast. They talked constantly, shared everything, checked in often. At first it felt intimate, like closeness. But closeness and crowding are not the same thing. The difference is subtle. Closeness feels chosen, crowding feels unavoidable. The person who overloves doesn't notice this shift because they're acting from sincerity. They think love means presence, consistency, availability. So they give more reassurance, more communication, more emotional access. And slowly the other person starts pulling back, not because they don't care, but because their nervous system is overwhelmed. Here's what most people misunderstand. Attraction is not built on emotional quantity. It's built on emotional regulation. When someone floods a relationship with emotion, they remove tension. And tension is what keeps connection alive. Overloving collapses polarity. Instead of two individuals choosing closeness, it becomes one person pouring and the other receiving. That imbalance changes everything. The overlover starts monitoring reactions. Are they responding slower? Are they quieter today? Did I say too much? So they compensate. They explain more. They reassure more. They try to restore closeness by increasing intensity. But intensity doesn't restore attraction. It accelerates withdrawal. The other person starts needing space. Not because they want distance, but because they need room to feel themselves again. This is emotional flooding. And it's one of the fastest ways to kill desire without ever meaning to. The Stoics warned against excess in all things, not because excess is immoral, but because excess removes balance. In relationships, emotional excess removes polarity. And polarity is what creates charge. The overlover is not weak. They are uncontained. They are emotionally expressive without emotional boundaries. And boundaries are what allow intimacy to breathe. Without boundaries, love turns into pressure. Not intentional pressure, but felt pressure. The person on the receiving end starts feeling responsible. Responsible for responding correctly, responsible for matching intensity, responsible for managing someone else's emotions. And responsibility is not attractive. Responsibility creates obligation. Obligation suffocates desire. This is where people get defensive. They say, so I'm not allowed to love deeply? That's not the point. You can love deeply without flooding. The problem isn't depth, it's overflow. Overloving means your emotions spill into the relationship without filtration. You don't pause. You don't regulate. You don't allow space. You feel something and immediately transmit it. That immediacy removes mystery, removes anticipation, removes emotional breathing room. The person receiving it doesn't get to miss you. They don't get to lean in. They're already submerged. This is why overloving often leads to one person saying, I just don't feel the same anymore. And the overlover is shocked because nothing bad happened, but something essential disappeared. Space. Desire requires space, not distance. Space. Space to choose. Space to wonder. Space to feel drawn instead of filled. The overlover unknowingly becomes emotionally loud, not in volume, in frequency, constant check-ins, constant reassurance, constant emotional presence. And constant presence removes contrast. Without contrast, attraction fades into familiarity. The Stoic principle here is restraint, not suppression. Restraint means choosing when and how emotion is expressed. It means allowing feelings to settle before releasing them. It means not turning every internal state into shared information. Because intimacy is not total transparency. Intimacy is selective vulnerability. The overlover gives everything at once. And when everything is available, nothing feels rare. The other person doesn't feel chased. They feel crowded. This is where the emotional power game reveals itself again. The person who floods loses leverage. Because leverage comes from containment. When you can hold emotion without immediately expressing it, you retain center. When you immediately offload emotion, you lose center. And center is what keeps attraction alive. This episode isn't about loving less. It's about loving with regulation. Because love without regulation becomes emotional noise. And noise pushes people away. Not because they don't care, but because they can't breathe. This is why overloving feels safe to the giver, but overwhelming to the receiver. Two very different experiences in the same relationship. The overlover thinks, I'm showing how much I care. The other person feels, I'm being emotionally crowded. And that mismatch creates withdrawal. Quietly, gradually. This is where most relationships break. Not in conflict, but in saturation. Too much of a good thing, without space, becomes suffocating. And once suffocation enters, desire leaves. This is only the beginning of the story. Because emotional flooding doesn't just push people away, it also trains the overlover to abandon themselves. And that's where the real cost begins. Emotional flooding doesn't just overwhelm the other person, it slowly drains the one doing the flooding. Because when you overlove, you don't just give affection, you give away your center. At first it feels right. You feel connected, you feel expressive, you feel close. But over time, something subtle changes inside you. You start watching their reactions more than your own feelings. You adjust your tone, you measure your words, you sense shifts and respond immediately. Your emotional radar stays permanently on. And that's exhausting. The overlover doesn't realize they're abandoning themselves. They believe they're nurturing the relationship, but they're actually outsourcing their emotional stability. Their peace becomes dependent on responsiveness. Their calm depends on consistency. And once your nervous system depends on another person's behavior, you lose internal regulation. This is why emotional flooding always creates imbalance. One person is emotionally overflowing. The other is emotionally retreating. And that asymmetry breaks attraction, not because love disappears, but because polarity collapses. The person receiving the flood doesn't feel chosen anymore. They feel responsible. They feel like they have to manage expectations. And that management creates pressure. Pressure turns affection into obligation. And obligation suffocates desire. This is the point where people say, I feel like I'm losing myself. They're not wrong. They are. Because overloving isn't just loving the other person. It's neglecting your own emotional containment. The Stoics believe that virtue lies in moderation, not emotional repression, but balance. They understood that excess, even of good things, destabilizes the soul. In relationships, emotional excess destabilizes attraction. When everything is shared immediately, nothing is held. And what isn't held cannot create tension. Tension isn't conflict. It's potential. The potential to move closer. The potential to pull back. The potential to choose. Overloving removes choice. It turns intimacy into constant exposure. The person on the receiving end doesn't get to lean in. They're already immersed. So they pull back, not to punish, to breathe. This is why emotional flooding often triggers sudden distance. The overlover is shocked. They think, I was doing everything right. And they were, in intention, but intention doesn't override nervous system response. Human attraction doesn't operate on logic. It operates on felt experience. And being emotionally flooded feels heavy. Not loving, heavy. The overlover then makes the worst possible mistake. They notice the distance and increase output. More reassurance, more affection, more explanation. Trying to restore closeness by doubling down. But doubling down intensifies the problem because flooding creates withdrawal. Withdrawal triggers anxiety. Anxiety fuels more flooding, and the cycle feeds itself. This is how relationships implode without ever exploding. No fight, no betrayal, just emotional saturation. The Stoic principle that breaks this cycle is restraint. Restraint is not silence. It's regulation. It's the ability to feel deeply without immediately acting on the feeling. It's the pause between impulse and expression. In that pause, attraction survives. The overlover collapses the pause. Emotion, expression, reaction. Instantly. The regulated lover restores the pause. Emotion, reflection, choice. That choice preserves polarity. Polarity is not dominance. It's difference. Difference keeps desire alive. When two people become emotionally merged, desire fades. Because desire requires two distinct centers. Overloving dissolves distinction. It blurs boundaries. And blurred boundaries create discomfort. Not consciously, physiologically. The nervous system senses when individuality disappears. And it responds by pulling away. This is why emotionally regulated people feel attractive. Not because they care less, but because they don't flood. They let emotions settle. They let space exist. They let the other person move toward them. The overlover moves first, every time. And whoever moves first repeatedly loses leverage. Not intentionally, energetically. This episode isn't asking you to suppress affection. It's asking you to stop outsourcing your emotional regulation. Because the moment your emotional safety depends on constant connection, you stop being grounded. And groundedness is what attraction responds to. The person receiving the flood isn't cruel. They're overwhelmed. They don't want less love. They want less pressure. And pressure isn't created by intensity. It's created by frequency. Constant emotional availability removes mystery, removes anticipation, removes longing. Longing is what pulls people closer. Flooding eliminates longing. And without longing, desire withers. The overlover thinks they're building intimacy. But intimacy without space becomes enmeshment. And enmeshment kills polarity. This is where the emotional power game becomes unavoidable. The person who floods loses power because they give away emotional choice. They're always open, always available, always expressive. And what is always available loses perceived value. Not because it's unworthy, but because it's abundant. Attraction doesn't grow in abundance. It grows in presence plus space. The Stoics would say this simply: you must hold yourself before you hold another. If you abandon your center to love someone, you create imbalance. And imbalance pushes people away, not because they don't love you, but because they don't feel room to breathe. This is why overloving feels safe to the giver, but unsafe to the receiver. Two different experiences, same relationship. And unless this pattern is interrupted, it always ends the same way, with distance, silence, confusion. And the overlover asking, how did loving more make things worse? That question leads to the final realization, which is where this episode ends. The moment people finally understand why overloving pushes others away, something uncomfortable happens. They realize the problem was never love. It was regulation. Overloving doesn't come from too much affection. It comes from uncontained emotion, from needing closeness to feel safe, from using connection as emotional grounding. And when love becomes a regulator instead of an expression, it turns heavy. The overlover doesn't notice this shift at first, because it feels natural to give when you care. But slowly love stops being shared and starts being poured. And pouring creates imbalance. The other person feels it immediately, not as rejection, as pressure. Pressure to respond correctly. Pressure to match intensity. Pressure to stay emotionally present at all times. And pressure kills desire. Not instantly, quietly. This is why the person pulling away often can't explain why. They say things like, "I just need space. I don't know what changed. I feel overwhelmed." They're not lying. They just don't have the language for emotional flooding. The nervous system does. And the nervous system always responds before the mind catches up. The overlover feels confused because from their perspective, nothing harmful happened. They were attentive. They were caring. They were consistent. But consistency without space becomes saturation. And saturation dulls attraction. This is where the Stoic lesson becomes clear. You cannot give what you cannot contain. When emotion flows outward without structure, it destabilizes both people. Stoicism teaches mastery of the inner world before expression, not repression. Mastery, meaning you feel fully, but you choose how and when those feelings are shared. The overlover bypasses choice. Emotion appears and is immediately transmitted. That immediacy feels honest. But honesty without restraint can still be overwhelming. This is why emotionally stable people feel attractive. Not because they're distant, but because they're selective. They don't make every feeling the other person's responsibility. They don't offload emotional states in real time. They let feelings settle. And settled emotion carries clarity. Unsettled emotion carries urgency. Urgency pushes people away. Because urgency feels like need, and need collapses polarity. The turning point for the overlover is painful. They realize that loving more did not bring closeness, it brought distance. Not because the other person was flawed, but because the emotional system became overloaded. This realization often triggers guilt. People ask themselves, "So I'm not allowed to care deeply? So love is a mistake? So I have to hold back?" No, you don't have to love less. You have to love with boundaries. Boundaries are not walls. They are filters. They decide what is shared, when, and how. Boundaries allow intimacy to grow instead of overwhelm. The overlover didn't lack love. They lacked containment. And containment is what allows love to be received. Think of it this way. Water is life-giving. But if you open a fire hydrant inside a house, it destroys the structure. Not because water is bad, but because it wasn't regulated. Emotion works the same way. Overloving floods the emotional space, and flooded spaces cannot support desire. The Stoics believe that emotional strength comes from holding one's inner state without collapse. That strength is felt, and feeling it creates attraction. When someone knows you won't emotionally spill onto them, they relax. They feel free, and freedom invites closeness. The moment the overlover learns to pause, not withdraw, everything changes. They stop filling silence. They stop over-checking. They stop explaining feelings before they've settled. They remain present, without pressure. And presence without pressure feels safe. Safe enough for desire to return. Not always, not instantly, but often. Because polarity is restored. The emotional power game shifts again. The person who floods loses power because they give away emotional choice. The person who contains regains power. Not by pulling away, but by recentering. This is the final paradox. The less you need the relationship to regulate your emotions, the healthier the relationship becomes. The less you flood, the more space exists. The more space exists, the more desire can breathe. This doesn't guarantee someone will stay. Nothing does. But it guarantees you won't lose yourself in the process. And that alone restores dignity. Overloving teaches a hard lesson. Love without self-regulation becomes self-erasure. And self-erasure is never attractive. Not because it's weak, but because it removes polarity. This episode isn't about becoming distant. It's about becoming whole. Whole people don't flood. They share, they allow, they choose. And choice is what makes love feel alive. The emotional power game ends the moment you stop using love to soothe anxiety. When love becomes expression instead of regulation, attraction stabilizes. Not through effort, through balance. That's why overloving pushes people away. Not because love is wrong, but because love needs structure to survive. And once you understand that, you stop losing people to emotional flooding and start keeping yourself intact, which is where real connection begins.